Welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be exploring The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama and Howard C. Cutler. I'm really excited to dig into this one.
Yeah, me too. It's such a classic. I think everyone can get something out of this book, you know?
Totally. I think what I'm most curious about is how do you actually put these ideas into practice? Like, it's one thing to read about happiness, but how do we actually make it happen in our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
And that's what I love about this book. It's not just some abstract philosophy. It actually gives you tools and techniques you can use.
All right, let's jump in then. So, right off the bat, the book dives into this idea that the purpose of life is happiness.
Yeah.
Now, at first, I was a little is that kind of selfish? But the book makes a really compelling case.
Yeah, it really digs into how it's not about just like indulging yourself.
Yeah, it's more than that.
It's about cultivating a state of mind that actually allows you to be more compassionate and helpful to others.
That makes sense. Because if you're all stressed out and miserable, you're probably not going to be that great of a friend or partner or, just a human being in general.
Exactly. And there's actually a ton of research to back that up. Like studies show that happier people are more likely to volunteer, to donate to charity. They're more engaged in their communities.
That's amazing. So it's almost like happiness is like this ripple effect. It starts with you, but then it spreads outwards.
It totally is. It's like contagious in a good way. But here's the thing. You know, the book talks about this concept called adaptation, and it really blew my mind when I first read about it.
Okay, tell me more about this, because I'm fascinated by this idea.
Okay, so basically it means that no matter what happens in our lives, good or bad, we tend to return to a baseline level of happiness.
So even if you win the lottery, you're not going to be happy forever.
Right, like obviously you'll be ecstatic at first, but eventually that initial high wears off and you kind of go back to your normal level of happiness.
That is wild. And it's the same for negative events too. Even if you go through something really tough, you eventually kind of adjust.
Exactly. Think about it like this. Have you ever heard that anecdote about lottery winners and accident victims?
Oh yeah, I think I've heard about that. It's like they both end up kind of in the same place emotionally after a while.
Exactly. Like, obviously their lives are completely different, but their overall level of happiness tends to even out over time.
Okay, so it's almost like happiness isn't so much about our circumstances, but more about our internal state.
You got it. And the book highlights two main paths to finding that contentment. The first path is basically trying to get everything you want.
Okay, so the classic consumerism, I need more stuff to be happy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The problem is that our desires are kind of endless, you know? Like you get one thing and then you immediately want something else. It's never enough.
It's like that feeling of oh, if I just had that new phone, then I'd be happy. But then you get the phone and it's like, okay, what's next?
Exactly. It's a trap. So that leads us to the second path, which is all about appreciating what you already have.
Okay, I like the sound of that one better.
Yeah, this one is all about focusing on the good things in your life, the things you're grateful for.
So practicing gratitude.
Exactly. And this path is way more sustainable because it's not dependent on external things. It's about shifting your mindset.
So instead of always wanting more, it's about being content with what you have.
Yes. And the book actually uses a great example to illustrate this. There are these two friends, right? One of them comes into sudden wealth, and the other one receives a life-changing diagnosis.
Wow, that's a stark contrast.
Right.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show you that happiness isn't always tied to what happens to us. Like, you can be going through something really difficult and still find a way to be content.
Like Christopher Reeve's story.
Absolutely. He's such an inspiration. Even after his accident, he found a way to find joy and purpose in life.
And he did so much to help others too. He could have easily just given up, but he chose to focus on what he still could do.
Right. He focused on his assets, his ability to think, his ability to communicate, and he used those abilities to advocate for others and make a real difference in the world.
It's a powerful reminder that we always have a choice in how we respond to our circumstances. Okay, I'm really starting to get this. But let's talk about something that I think we all struggle with. Comparison.
Yes. The comparison game.
That's like a happiness killer. You're scrolling through social media and everyone else seems to have this perfect life.
It's so easy to get caught up in that. And the book really hits the nail on the head when it talks about how comparing ourselves to others, especially those who seem to have it all, just leads to dissatisfaction.
Yeah, it's like you're constantly measuring yourself against some impossible standard.
And you always come up short. But here's the thing. The book also talks about how we can actually use comparison to our advantage.
Wait, really? How do you do that?
By shifting your focus. Instead of comparing yourself to those who have more, try comparing yourself to those who have less.
Oh, interesting. So like focusing on what you're grateful for.
Exactly. And there's actually research that shows this works. Like, they did studies where people simply thought about how things could be worse, and just that shift in perspective actually increased their satisfaction with their own lives,
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
isn't it? It shows you how much power our thoughts have over our happiness. And that brings us to what I think is one of the biggest takeaways from the book, this idea of training your mind for happiness.
Okay, I'm all ears. How do we train our minds to be happier?
Well, the Dalai Lama uses this amazing analogy. He compares the mind to a field. Like a farmer needs to carefully cultivate their field, right?
Yeah, planting the right seeds, getting rid of the weeds.
Exactly. And it's the same with our minds. We need to be mindful of what we're planting, what thoughts and emotions we're allowing to grow.
So like weeding out the negative thoughts and nurturing the positive ones.
Exactly. Like if you're constantly focusing on things that are upsetting you, you're basically planting seeds of negativity in your mind. But if you focus on things you're grateful for, things that make you happy, you're planting seeds of joy and contentment.
That makes so much sense. But how do we actually do that? Like, it's one thing to say, oh, I'm going to focus on the positive, but our minds have a way of like going back to those negative thought patterns.
Yeah, for sure. It takes practice. But the key is to be aware of your thoughts and to gently redirect them when they start to spiral. And this is where things like meditation can be really helpful.
So it's not about like forcing yourself to be happy all the time. It's more about like cultivating a more positive and resilient mindset.
Exactly. And it's a process that takes time and effort, but it's totally worth it. And this brings us to something that's really central to the book, compassion.
Compassion.
Yeah, and it might seem kind of obvious, but the Dalai Lama presents compassion as not just some nice to have quality, but as a fundamental key to human happiness.
It's like we're all connected, right? So when we help others, we're actually helping ourselves too.
Exactly. And there's even this concept in Buddhism called the field of merit, which I find fascinating. It's this idea that every time we act with compassion, we're creating positive energy, not just for others, but for ourselves as well.
I love that. So it's like good karma in action. But
Yeah.
what about people who aren't naturally compassionate? Like what if someone's just not wired that way?
That's a great question. And the Dalai Lama actually addresses that head on. He argues that even if you're motivated by self-interest, acting with compassion still brings benefits.
So it's like a win-win. Like you're helping others and you're helping yourself at the same time.
Precisely. It's not about being a saint. It's about recognizing that compassion is actually in our own best interest.
That's a really powerful message. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Let's explore it further in part 2.
Sounds good to me. See you in part 2.
Okay, so we were talking about compassion and how it's kind of like this secret weapon for happiness.
Right. It's like, who knew being kind to others could actually make you feel better?
But let's be real for a second. Life isn't always sunshine and rainbows.
No, it's not.
What about when things are tough?
Yeah.
Like when you're dealing with real suffering, how can you possibly be happy then?
It's a great question, and the book actually talks about this a lot. Like, it doesn't shy away from the difficult stuff. In fact, it encourages us to embrace the reality of suffering.
Embrace it. That seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
I know, right? But hear me out. The Dalai Lama makes this point that suffering is just an inherent part of life.
Like you can't avoid it.
Exactly. It's going to happen to all of us at some point. So instead of trying to run away from it or pretend it's not there, he suggests we try to change our relationship to suffering.
Okay, so like how do we do that?
Well, it starts with acceptance, like acknowledging that suffering is just part of the human experience. It's not a sign that you're doing something wrong or that you're a bad person. It's just life. Yeah. I remember that funny line from the book where the Dalai Lama says that birthdays should really be called Happy Birth of Suffering Day.
Aha, right. It's like a reminder that from the moment we're born, we're going to experience both joy and sorrow.
That's a good way to put it. But knowing that suffering is inevitable, it still doesn't make it any easier to deal with when it actually happens.
Totally. But that's where this concept of samsara comes in. Have you ever heard of that?
Samsara. I think I've heard of it, but I'm not totally sure what it means.
So in Buddhism, it basically refers to this cycle of suffering that we get trapped in, and it's driven by our attachments and desires. You know, that constant wanting and craving for things to be different than they are.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Like when I get fixated on something I want,
Yeah.
and I don't get it, it can really make me miserable.
Exactly. And that's what samsara is all about. It's like we're constantly chasing after things, thinking that if we just get that next thing, that next promotion or whatever, then we'll finally be happy.
It's like that saying, the grass is always greener.
Exactly. And the Dalai Lama argues that the key to breaking free from this cycle of suffering is to let go of those attachments.
Okay, but how do you just let go of something you really want?
It's not easy, but it starts with recognizing that true happiness can't be found in external things. It's about cultivating a sense of inner peace and contentment that's not dependent on getting what you want all the time.
Okay, that makes sense, but it still seems kind of abstract. Like, how do you actually do that?
Well, the book talks about the Tibetan perspective on karma, which I think can be really helpful in understanding this.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So karma is this idea that our actions have consequences. Like every choice we make, every thought we have creates an imprint on our minds.
And those imprints shape our future experiences.
Exactly. And the Dalai Lama emphasizes that karma is not about punishment or reward. It's more about understanding that our current experiences are often influenced by our past actions.
Okay, so it's like taking responsibility for the choices we made. But how does that help us deal with suffering?
Well, it can help us to approach difficult situations with more wisdom and compassion. Like instead of blaming ourselves or getting stuck in anger and resentment, we can try to see our suffering as an opportunity for growth and learning.
So it's like reframing the experience. Instead of seeing it as something bad that's happening to you, you can see it as a chance to learn and evolve.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly empowering. It's like even when things are really tough, you still have a choice in how you respond.
I love that. So accepting suffering, understanding karma, these are all really helpful tools. But what about overcoming those specific obstacles to happiness that we all face?
Right.
Like anger, anxiety, low self-esteem. The book talks about these a lot too, right?
It does, and it offers some really practical advice on how to deal with them. Like, for example, when it comes to anger, the Dalai Lama is all about patience. He actually sees patience and tolerance as active forms of strength.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not about like suppressing your anger or pretending you're not angry.
No, it's more about choosing not to react in a way that's harmful to yourself or others, like taking a moment to pause before you lash out. Recognizing that anger is often a fleeting emotion, it'll pass.
So it's like choosing a more skillful response.
Exactly. And it takes practice, for sure. But the more you can cultivate patience, the less reactive you'll be. And when it comes to anxiety, the book talks a lot about the importance of sincere motivation.
I remember reading about that,
Hmm.
but I'm still not totally clear on what it means. Can you explain it a little more?
Sure, think of it like this. Sincere motivation is about acting with a good heart, without any intention to harm yourself or others. It's about aligning your actions with your values.
So it's like being true to yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book actually shares this great story about a shy college student who was terrified of talking to this girl he liked.
Oh, I think I remember that one.
Yeah, and he used this principle of sincere motivation to overcome his fear. Like, even though she already had a boyfriend, the fact that he was able to push past his anxiety and just be genuine with her was a huge victory for him.
That's such a great example. So it's not necessarily about the outcome. It's more about the intention behind your actions.
Right. And when it comes to things like low self-esteem, the book encourages us to challenge those negative beliefs we have about ourselves.
Like that inner critic that's always telling us we're not good enough.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing and celebrating our positive qualities. Like, instead of focusing on what we're bad at, we can try to focus on what we're good at.
It's like being your own best friend,
Mhm.
cheering yourself on instead of putting yourself down.
Exactly. And the book also talks about pride, which can be another tricky obstacle to happiness.
Pride. How so?
Well, the Dalai Lama sees pride as this kind of delusion that inflates our sense of self-importance. Like, we start to think we're better than others or that we know everything.
Oh, yeah, I can see how that could be a problem.
Right. And it can really get in the way of connecting with others and experiencing true joy. So the book suggests cultivating humility as an antidote to pride.
Humility.
Yeah, like recognizing that we're all just human beings, we all make mistakes, and there's so much we don't know. Like just reflecting on the vastness of the universe can help put things in perspective.
That's a good reminder. Okay, so we've talked about overcoming these common obstacles, but the book also talks a lot about spirituality.
It does.
What role does spirituality play in cultivating happiness, according to the Dalai Lama?
Well, he sees it as a fundamental part of a happy life.
Right.
But he's also very clear that spirituality doesn't have to be tied to religion.
So you don't have to be religious to be spiritual.
Exactly. He talks about how there are certain spiritual principles like compassion, forgiveness, and a sense of connection to something larger than yourself that are universal.
Yeah, like those values can benefit anyone, regardless of their beliefs.
Right. And the book actually talks about the scientifically proven benefits of religious faith, too.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, studies have shown that people who have strong religious beliefs tend to be happier and more resilient. They also tend to have better physical health.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. But of course, we can't ignore the downsides of religion either.
Of course not.
Like, there's been so much conflict and division throughout history that's been fueled by religion.
Yeah, and the book acknowledges that. Like, it uses the example of the conflict in Lebanon to illustrate how religious beliefs can sometimes be distorted and used to justify violence.
Right, so it's like anything else. It can be used for good or for bad.
Exactly. And the Dalai Lama emphasizes the importance of finding those universal spiritual values that can benefit everyone, regardless of their background.
So it's about focusing on the things that unite us rather than divide us. Okay, this has been a really illuminating conversation. We've covered so much ground,
We have.
but I'm still curious to hear more about how we can actually put all of this wisdom into practice.
Me too.
Let's continue our deep dive in part 3.
All right, so we've talked about a lot of really powerful concepts from the art of happiness, like changing our mindset, cultivating compassion, embracing spirituality. But I think one of the things that really stuck with me is this story that the book ends with. It's about the Dalai Lama and this really simple act of compassion.
Oh, yeah, I think you mentioned this story before. The one where he's walking through a crowd and he stops to talk to this young man who's really struggling.
Yes, exactly. I mean, just picture this. This Dalai Lama is walking through this huge crowd. There are all these people there to see him. Everyone's excited. But amidst all this commotion, he notices this young man who's clearly in distress.
Oh, man. That's got to be tough. I
Yeah.
mean, just to be surrounded by all these people and feeling so alone in your pain.
Right. And what's so incredible is that the Dalai Lama, even amidst all this chaos, he just picks up on this young man's suffering. He stops everything, breaks away from his security team, and just goes straight to him.
Wow. Can you imagine being that young man? Like you're in so much pain and then suddenly the Dalai Lama is there, showing you this incredible kindness and compassion.
It's such a powerful moment. And the book describes how the young man just starts talking, like really rapidly. He's so agitated, trying to explain everything that's going on. But instead of like trying to interrupt or offer advice, the Dalai Lama just takes his hand, holds it gently, looks him right in the eyes, and just nods.
That's so beautiful. Just that simple act of listening, of being present with someone who's hurting. Sometimes that's all it takes.
Exactly. And the book describes how you could just see the effect it had on the young man. Like all that anxiety, all that distress, it just started to melt away. And then he starts to cry, and then this small smile appears on his face. It's this moment of pure relief and comfort.
That story just gives me chills. It's such a powerful reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can have such a profound impact. Just acknowledging someone's pain and showing them that you care can be so healing.
It really can. And for me, that story really encapsulates the essence of the art of happiness. It's not about achieving some kind of permanent state of bliss. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, cultivating compassion for ourselves and others, and understanding that true happiness comes from inner transformation, not from external
It's
achievements.
like happiness isn't something you find out there in the world. It's something you create within yourself.
Exactly. And it's a journey, a lifelong journey full of ups and downs, but it's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know about you, but this deep dive has been incredibly inspiring for me. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on
Me
happiness.
too. The Art of Happiness is definitely a book that I'll be revisiting again and again. It's just packed with so much wisdom.
And I think it's a book that anyone can benefit from, regardless of their background or beliefs.
Totally.
So if you're looking for some practical guidance on how to cultivate a happier and more fulfilling life, I highly encourage you to check it out. And remember, the pursuit of happiness is a journey. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and keep cultivating those seeds of inner peace. Until next time.